This is a letter written by a man in 1628 who'd been thrown into prison after being accused of witchcraft. Many 100,000 good nights, dearly beloved daughter Veronica. Innocent have I come into prison, innocent have I been tortured, innocent must I die. For whoever comes into the witch prison must be tortured until he invents something out of his head. When I was the first time put to the torture, Dr. Braun, Dr. Kotzendorfer, and two strange doctors were there. Then Dr. Braun asks me, "Kinsman, how come you here?" I answer, "Through falsehood, through misfortune." "Hear you," he retorts, "you are a witch. Will you confess it voluntarily? If not, we'll bring in witnesses and the executioner for you." I said, "I am no witch. I have a pure conscience in the matter. If there are 1,000 witnesses, I am not anxious." The witnesses were brought forward. And then came also, God in highest heaven have mercy, the executioner, and put the thumbscrews on me, both hands bound together, so that the blood ran out at the nails and everywhere, so that for 4 weeks I could not use my hands, as you can see from the writing. Thereafter they first stripped me, bound my hands behind me, and drew me up in the strappado. Then I thought heaven and earth were at an end. 8 times did they draw me up and let me fall again, so that I suffered terrible agony. And so I made my confession, but it was all a lie. Now follows, dear child, what I confessed in order to escape the great anguish and bitter torture which it was impossible for me longer to bear. Then I had to tell what people I had seen at the witches' Sabbath. I said that I had not recognized them. "You old rascal, I must set the executioner at you. Say, was not the chancellor there?" So I said yes. "Who besides?" I had not recognized anybody. So he said, "Take one street after another, begin at the market, go out on one street and back on the next." I had to name several persons there. Then came the long street. I knew nobody. I had to name 8 persons there, and thus continually they asked me on all the streets, though I could not and would not say more. So they gave me to the executioner, told him to strip me, shave me all over, and put me to the torture. Then I had to tell what crimes I had committed. I said nothing. "Draw the rascal up!" So I said that I was to kill my children, but I had killed a horse instead. It did not help. I had also taken a sacred wafer and had desecrated it. When I had said this, they left me in peace. Dear child, keep this letter secret, else I shall be tortured most piteously, and the jailers will be beheaded. Good night, for your father Johannes Junius will never see you more. This horrific letter was smuggled out of prison by a jailer sympathetic to Johannes Junius in Germany in 1628. Now, his case is not unusual. In fact, it's representative of what people had to go through if they were accused of witchcraft. This is episode 2 of Villains and Virgins. In this series, we're discussing witchcraft in Europe and how it led to the Salem witch trials in the New World. Once dragged in to be examined on this charge, a list of questions were put to the accused witch, and the questions were pretty much the same. You weren't asked if you were a witch. You were asked when you had signed a pact with the devil, what the name of your demon lover was, which people in the village you had seen at the witches' Sabbath who were also witches with you, and when you had harmed Mrs. Hubbard's cow. So the presumption here was of guilt. Torture would be applied mercilessly until the accused witch offered a confession which fit the questions that the inquisitors would put to him or her. Most of these people were women, but there were men like poor Johannes Junius here who also suffered. The fact that people supplied confessions to the list of standard questions was then taken by witch hunters as evidence that this was what witches did. They all had demon lovers, they all had witches' Sabbaths at which they had orgies, they all ate children, and so on. Of course, the people being tortured in these hideous ways were desperate to say anything that would make their torturers stop. While it looked like evidence, The only thing it really showed was the effectiveness of the painful procedures being applied to these people. Now, to remind you, the witch craze in Europe is estimated to have caused the deaths of 60,000 people. And more than 100,000 were arrested and tortured on witchcraft charges. This is an enormous number. It was all over Europe, in some countries more than others. France had a large number of cases, also Germany, also the Netherlands. In places where the power of the Catholic Church was not so centralized, and where there were episodes of what might be termed heresy, or belief that was considered wrong by the Church, the accusations of witchcraft as a variation of heresy also flourished. Now, England had been more or less quieter than the rest of Europe on the charges of witchcraft until the early 1600s, and the reason for that was King James I of England. You might know him as the one who commissioned the King James Version of the Bible, which has been sort of the canonical version of the Bible in English for many hundreds of years. It was commissioned in 1611, and the Elizabethan English of that time is still preserved in that translation of the Bible. But King James, while being not a Catholic, but rather an ardent Calvinist Protestant, also believed in witches and wrote a book called Demonology. So he brought his belief in witches to England, which legitimized the searching for and persecution of witches. And the fact that he was so concerned about the problem is even preserved in Shakespeare's play Macbeth, which was penned for the enjoyment of King James I and his court, the Scottish play, not surprising. King James came from Scotland. And who could forget the three witches stirring a cauldron, whom Macbeth encounters in the woods? The appearance of those witches in this play that had been created for the pleasure of the king are not a coincidence. They reflect the fact that he was an ardent believer in witchcraft. When this became official, because the king believed it, we see a sharp uptick in the number of witch trials that happen in England, which is significant because the roots of the witch trials in Salem, New England, in North America, come from a group of people, the Puritans, who live in England at this time and shortly thereafter. While the European witch craze took slightly longer to arrive in England than it did on countries on the continent, the methods were very much the same. Here's a description of the witch house in Bamberg, Germany, which was used for the interrogation of accused witches. The witch house of Bamberg contained thumbscrews, leg vices, whipping stocks furnished with iron spikes, scalding lime baths, prayer stools furnished with sharp pegs, racks, the strappado, and other devices. If you've never heard of the strappado, it's a device in which the victim's arms are tied behind his back with a rope attached to a pulley. He is then hoisted in the air, hanging off of his arms, which are behind him and above his head. Sometimes weights are attached to the victim's legs to increase the pressure on the shoulder joints. People would be held in this way for hours, and the agony that it produces is excruciating. Apparently, the SS used this to torture Jews in some cases. It's a time-honored tradition in the arsenal of torture, and it was used quite extensively in Europe at this time as well. Now, there's an element of the interrogation of witches which is particularly difficult for, I think, modern people to understand, and that is that the inquisitors often believed the torture was for the good of the witch herself. It may seem hard to believe, but this is how it worked. Inquisitors believed that the witch had already made a pact with the devil and sold her soul, which means that when she would die, her soul would be turned over to the devil for an eternity in hell. However, her only hope of salvation lay in being arrested, confessing and recanting her witchcraft under interrogation before she was executed. as she invariably would be after confessing to being a witch. So in this case, while death was certain, the application of torture to encourage somebody to admit and recant their witchcraft was seen as a tool to save the witch's soul. But after all, even if the witch's soul didn't end up being saved, at least the dangerous witch, a servant of Satan, would be removed from the society, and the danger of her evil practice would no longer be a threat. So it's bizarre to imagine some of these torturers actually appealing to the witch's own soul, to the good of the witch's soul, to elicit these confessions. There were many levers that were applied to an accused witch to encourage confession. Of course, there was the ever-present threat of more terrible and more inventive torture. But there was also sometimes the promise of a more merciful death. So a convicted witch would be executed. In England, the usual method was hanging. In other parts of Europe, it was burning. However, a witch who confessed and recanted might be offered the small mercy of being strangled before being burned at the stake. So there were incentives to confess. There was also a lot of pressure put on a witch, an accused witch, to name other people who lived in the village, other people that you knew, because there must have been other witches involved. And so failure to name others meant that you had an insufficient confession. And so people like poor Johannes Junius here were often tortured mercilessly until they named other people, knowing full well that the names they supplied were people who were going to undergo exactly the same horrific treatment that they themselves were suffering. To continue our story, we need to return our focus to England, where King James I, a staunch Calvinist Protestant, has reinforced and encouraged the belief in witchcraft. Now, it's important to understand a few things about why England was in other ways different than the rest of Europe. The Protestant Reformation, which we discussed in the last episode, had divided Western Christianity between Catholics and the newly formed Protestants, the critics of Orthodox Catholic Christianity. But that movement of criticism had already begun to fragment into smaller communities. So there were Calvinists who followed the teachings of John Calvin in Geneva. There were Lutherans who followed Martin Luther, and there were many, many other subgroups. England was officially a Protestant country, but it wasn't Protestant as a matter of conviction. It was Protestant as a matter of political convenience. So for those of you who have been watching certain series on Netflix about the Tudors, you'll know this story. But if you've forgotten the fine detail, King Henry VIII, going back to the 1500s, wants to get rid of his Catholic wife. He is unable to do so, though, because the church frowns on divorce and because she happens to be the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain, which is politically a much more powerful country than England. However, he finally finds a way to divorce his wife and marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn. And in order to do that, he has to separate England from the authority of the Catholic Church, which refuses to grant him a divorce. So King Henry VIII says, from now on, we are going to have the Church of England. And the king is sort of in charge of the Church of England and of appointing its bishops and its ministers. So he becomes the new center of authority for the church that exists in England outside of the Catholic Church. But it was a political move. So in practice, the Church of England, in its liturgy, in its prayers, in its forms, was very much the same as what was going on the continent with Catholic churches. It was just officially answerable to the King of England and not the Pope in Rome. But because the influence of Protestant ideas had been spreading throughout Europe and in England too, there were many people who were firmly convicted and ideologically opposed to the structure of the Catholic Church and saw it as abusive of its authority and as standing in the way of the relationship that individual people could have with God. So, some of these convicted Protestants who were ideological and not simply following the political line, thought that the Church of England should become truly a Protestant church, not simply a Catholic church with a Church of England label on it. By the way, the Church of England still exists. It's known as the Anglican Church. Same organization. In England, this movement of people who were hardcore Protestants became known as the Puritans because they wanted to purify the Church of England, and they wanted to see a truly Protestant teaching come in, which reduced the role of ministers. It changed the way prayers were done, the way sacraments were understood in the church, and made it much more individualistic. Of course, these people were seen as stirring the pot by many others in England who were perfectly happy with the status quo and the way things were. But the Puritans would form their own little communities and sometimes their own separate congregations, where they began to hold church services and appoint their own ministers who were not official church appointees. And that began to create problems. So the Puritans in England persist because the Church of England is formed in the 1500s, and this movement of convicted Protestant reform goes on and builds in power in the next 100 years as the Protestant Reformation really takes off and changes hearts and minds across Europe. You may also have heard of the Puritans under another name, sometimes called the Roundheads, because in 1649, there were a group of them who supported Oliver Cromwell, also a Puritan, and they opposed a successor of James I, Charles I of England. So we're dealing now with another king, a generation later, and the Puritans in this instance had a lot of sway in Parliament. Oliver Cromwell was one of them, and they thought that the king was really too Catholic, too continental in many ways, and that he was doing a lot of other things wrong. So this led to a civil war in England, which actually ended up, perhaps for the only time, with an English king having his head chopped off by an executioner in public. That unfortunate man was Charles I. And for a time, Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan, became Lord Protector of England, a king in all but name. However, this brief and colorful period in English history didn't last very long. It was succeeded by the Glorious Revolution, in which Charles I's son returned to England from Europe and things settled down. But for many of the Puritans who had been in England around this time, they weren't satisfied with that outcome. Some of them left the country because they felt that they weren't free to practice their beliefs where they were in England, and that the type of religious freedom that they were looking for could only be achieved elsewhere. So we see some of them going to the Netherlands, some of them going to other parts of Europe like Germany, and eventually one group of Puritans, the ones who are going to form the nucleus of the next chapter of our story, go to the New World. They land in Massachusetts, in New England, and that's where we're going to go next. The Puritans who come to New England were a diverse bunch, and they came in small waves, some in one ship to one part of New England, some in another ship farther down the coast. The people who were aboard the famous Mayflower, many of them came from the same Puritan background. But our story involves another group of Puritans, not the ones on the Mayflower, but very similar, who live in a small village called Salem in 1692 in Massachusetts. Before we go any farther, it's important to understand what life was like for these people, because it really informs the mindset and the behavior that are otherwise going to be difficult for us to understand. These people had arrived as settlers in a place that was very much wild. There were a lot of forests, there were a lot of wild animals, the land wasn't particularly fertile, and there were a lot of indigenous people, referred to in the literature at the time as Indians, who weren't necessarily very happy to see them. In fact, there were not one, not two, but three official Indian wars in the 1600s between groups of settlers who had come from England and the continent and local indigenous tribes. These conflicts were often the result of land disputes, of injustices or of abuses that one group of people had perpetrated onto members of another. They were incredibly gory, but not all of them were wars in the way that you and I might imagine them, where men on horses with muskets or bows and arrows lined up and took shots at each other. There were some confrontations like that, but many of these confrontations were fought by smaller groups of people, hand to hand, on homesteads, on farms, and in the woods. There are stories of small groups of settlers attacking and killing Indians, and then there are many stories of Indian bands coming for reprisals to farmsteads and cutting down men, boys, women, and children who were found there on the land, on the farms. So there was an environment of fear, of terror, for a lot of settlers living in these areas where they were constantly being told about episodes of violence or of small-scale massacres, the farm down the road. Everything that breathed was killed in horrific ways and left outside, found by other settlers who came by. This feeling of fear and of being under threat was something that pervaded New England at this time. Settler colonies in New England were officially under the rule of some sort of governor who was connected to Britain. So officially they had a tie to British authority. There was some governor who'd been appointed and sent over for each settler area, and he was sort of the point of law and order, the authority in that town or in that settlement. Of course, this was not without problems, and the particular village that we're going to be talking about in Salem had recently gotten rid of a British governor whom they saw as tyrannical and overbearing. At the time this story takes place, members of this community had gone back to England, one or two of them, to negotiate the appointment of a new British governor for the colony. But it wasn't just the outsiders, the potential Indians in the area, that Puritan settlers were worried about. There were divisions inside these communities that were stark and often religiously based, and they form the backdrop against which this story is going to play out. So while Puritans had left England in pursuit of religious freedom, they had a very single idea of what that religious freedom looked like. And you were only able to be free in the way that Puritans thought you should be. Unlike some other colonies, such as Rhode Island, that were a little more free-thinking, the Puritans of Salem and the surrounding area were extremely rigid about proper religious practice. It was just important that it be their version of proper religious practice. So to make it more clear, you couldn't practice your religion if you were Catholic. You definitely couldn't practice it if you were a Jew. You couldn't even practice it if you were a Quaker, which is kind of shocking because Quakers were also Protestants. They still exist today as a community. They're generally known for being quite pacifist and having much more gender equality than a lot of other religious communities, including among Protestants. But even Quakers were considered a threat to proper religious practice in New England. And quite famously, there was a young woman in 1660 called Mary Dyer who was executed for publicly preaching Quaker beliefs and ideas inside a Puritan settlement. So you would think that people who left England in pursuit of religious freedom would be more open to letting other people have the same thing, but you would be wrong. Salem Village, where our story takes place, in the 1690s, had between 500 and 600 inhabitants. It was an outcropping of an older settlement called Salem Town, which was more established and had a larger number of people. But Salem Village wanted to be its own entity because many people had difficulty traveling into Salem Town from their farms every week for church. And we'll get to church in a moment. But in addition to the settlers, there were two other classes of people. Three, really. You had Indians in the surrounding area who were sometimes trading partners and sometimes threats. Then you had indentured servants, which is something interesting to understand. Indentured servitude was a mechanism to bring more labor into the colonies, because not everyone had the money to afford the passage in a ship over to the New World, to North America. But People establishing farmsteads needed labor to turn the land into crops that would be enough to sustain life and to trade. So there was a need for more bodies. How to get more bodies over there? Well, someone who owned land in North America, in New England, could sign a contract through a broker with some less wealthy person in England, say, who wanted to come over to the New World and start a new life. So if that person in England signed a contract to be an indentured laborer, what it meant was the landlord in the New World would pay the passage for this laborer to come over to the New World. But once he arrived, he would be bound to a term of service, somewhere between 5 and 10 years, but the average length was about 7 years. During that time, the indentured laborer would live on the landlord's property and would be responsible for doing whatever labor that landlord required of him or her. If the indentured laborer survived his or her term of service, then they would be given a freedom package, which usually consisted of a small parcel of less attractive land, a gun, a supply of corn, possibly a horse or a cow, enough to begin to set up a small homestead of their own. But of course, many people didn't survive their term of indentured labor. That was the dirty secret that a lot of people in New England knew, but ambitious people coming over from Britain and elsewhere might not have been as aware of. In fact, by some accounts, more than 40% of indentured servants didn't survive their term of service. And while they were in service, they were very much at the mercy of that landlord. So breaking a rule, such as by running away, for example, or committing some other offense like getting pregnant in some way, could cause the term of service to be extended because of this violation that the servant had performed. And there are even accounts of servants who had suffered terrible punishments from their landlord masters, which included things like the slicing of tongues or the cutting off of ears. So it wasn't necessarily an amiable or equitable relationship. Female indentured servants were perhaps quite vulnerable to becoming pregnant even at the hands of their landlord. And male indentured servants could be seen as potential threats by other men in the community because they might be attractive to women who were already there, and they might form illicit relationships that could upset household harmony. So the indentured servant category was a feature of life in settler communities, but it wasn't without its difficulties. The final category was slaves. Now, in the 1690s, when our story takes place, the total number of slaves in New England was something like 2% of the population. It wasn't very high. And as time went on, the system of indentured servitude decreased in favor of slavery, which was cheaper and more profitable. Community life in Puritan settlements in New England revolved around the church. And the church was the Puritan Covenant Church. You weren't allowed to be a member of any other kind. You could attend church, but that might not necessarily mean you were a member of the church. So what happened was Salem Village in the 1670s wanted to have the right to form its own church instead of having to go into Salem town, which is a long drive by cart every Sunday for church services. In order to do this, they needed the right to hire their own minister and form their own committee of 5 members to assess and determine local taxes on the members of Salem Village to pay the salary of the minister. Now, you had to pay these taxes whether you were a full member of the church or not. Taxes were levied on everyone who lived in that settlement. You wanted to become a church member, though, because without church membership, you didn't have voting rights and you weren't able to have any say on how much those taxes should be. So the majority of people in a Puritan settlement in New England would be attending church regularly, but it didn't necessarily mean you were a member. In order to become a member, you had to demonstrate evidence of God's grace in your life, of being born again, of being a Christian of conviction, and not just of inheritance because you grew up in a family that happened to be Protestant or Puritan or whatnot. So how is this grace of God demonstrated? Well, it was the minister's job to scrutinize your life for evidence that God's grace was working there. And it was also the job of other full members of the church to scrutinize your life and make sure that no misdeed, no wrong word, no irreverent statement had escaped your lips. So if you were a churchgoer in Salem in the 1690s, you were attending church regularly, and you wanted to become a full member, you would approach the minister of that church and you would signal your desire to become a full member. He, the minister, would then ask you a number of questions to test your knowledge of proper belief. You needed to have the right answers to the questions he was going to ask you about grace and the nature of God and so on. Then the minister would inform all the other members of the church of your desire to become a full member. And the purpose of this was to encourage them to come forward with any evidence against you, any reason why you should not be admitted as a full member, such as immoral conduct or irreverent behavior. Now, if no one came forward, you would then be baptized as a full member of the church, as an adult, and this would signal your new status. By some accounts, only 20% of the population in New England at the time were full members of a church, but church attendance was required of everybody, as were taxes. Just because you were the child of a full member of the church did not make you a full member. You would have to seek that membership of your own volition when you became old enough. Now, church membership probably doesn't seem like a big deal to you or me, but it's not like there was another church down the road that you could go to. And if you didn't have full membership of the church, you couldn't vote on anything in the town, not just the taxes that were levied to pay for the minister, but any other town business that required a vote. That vote was only open to full church members. But in addition to being a full member of the church, you also had to be male, and you also had to own property. So that ruled out half the population, the females, right away, and it ruled out all those indentured servants who were men and threats and didn't yet own property. Slaves and Indians, of course, weren't even worth mentioning. So getting full membership in the church wasn't just a useful social title to have, there was actual practical value in it too. Speaking of children, of full members of Puritan communities in New England, there was a new practice that had been developed to allow them to participate, but perhaps not fully yet. And this was called the halfway covenant. So this was a new idea that was happening in some of these settler churches, including in Salem. And what it meant was, if you were a child in a Puritan family and both your parents were full members of the church, then you could be allowed to have this halfway covenant, which basically allowed you to participate in church the way that a member would, for the most part, until such time as you were old enough to seek full membership for yourself. So it was sort of getting your foot in the door. It was an extra cut of status. It meant you came from a good family. This was fairly new, though, and at the time our story takes place, Salem Village had 2 or 3 ministers that had come and gone in their newly formed church. They'd often gone because of conflict with the community, sometimes over salary, sometimes over practice. And now the Salem Village had found a new minister, Reverend Samuel Parris. And he begins serving in Salem Village in 1689, which is 2 or 3 years before the witch craze that is going to form the next chapter of our tale. Samuel Parris hadn't been a minister all his life. He hadn't even gone to seminary school. In fact, he'd been a merchant, and he'd gone back and forth from the New World. He had a slave woman named Tituba, of whom we will hear more very shortly. But he had decided that it would probably be a good career move to become an ordained minister. There was a more steady salary. You didn't have to worry about the risks of sending goods across the sea where they might get spoiled or sunk. So he got himself a couple of courses that he needed to be recognized as someone who could be ordained as a minister, and then he applied for the job, and he got it. But Samuel Parris was a hardliner. He was a stickler for orthodoxy, And this caused a lot of conflict in the community. It exacerbated the tensions between insiders and outsiders, even amongst the people who attended church regularly. One of the most controversial things he did was to get rid of the halfway covenant that they had devised to allow children of full members to sort of participate more fully than they otherwise might. He said, nope, no halfway covenant. And he made the lines of exclusion really stark, because once a month, when Puritan congregations would have communion, which is what Catholics refer to as the Eucharist, or the ceremonial drinking of wine and eating of bread in remembrance of Jesus' crucifixion and rising again. It's a feature of all Christian churches. Samuel Parris would make sure that anyone who wasn't a full member had to leave the church at that time. They couldn't even be in the same room, so that only insiders, only fully recognized members of the club could have access to this exclusive ritual, which, by the way, is pretty important in Christian belief. So he underlined the divisions, and this became really significant in the events that are about to unfold. Reverend Parris is significant because he really fed an existing psychological attitude amongst Puritan settlers in New England. These people actually welcomed hardship, and they welcomed adversity as almost a sign of virtue, because in their minds, if they were the servants of God, then the devil and his servants must be after them. If bad things were happening, including attacks by Indians or other hardships, it must be a sign that they were on the right path, that they were the virtuous ones, and that adversity was really a sign of the devil and the forces of darkness trying to thwart them. Now, this is really significant because it's going to inform attitudes and the willingness to believe in witches that is so central to what unfolds in Salem. Reverend Parris himself had very little tolerance for dissent or divergence from his own views. And some of his sermons really underline this welcoming of adversity and this emphasis on virtue. Other ministers in New England at the time were known to say things like, quote, "The malice of Satan and his instruments is very great against the children of God." And Reverend Samuel Parris himself echoes this sentiment in a sermon that he preaches in 1692, a couple of weeks before things begin to get really strange. In his sermon, he wrote, quote, "There are devils as well as saints in Christ's church. Christ knows how many of these devils there are, not only sinners, but notorious sinners, some more like to the devil than others. So here in Christ's little church." That last phrase, "this little church," means that Samuel Parris isn't referring to the church as the community of all Christians around the world. He's not even referring to the community of all Protestants or all Puritans. He's talking about the very small congregation within the wooden walls of his very church, this little church right here. There are some people who are more like the devil than others. The minister was clearly bringing the message home so that people would be looking to the right and left, wondering who among them might really be a servant of Satan or a notorious sinner. And so it's this emphasis on insiders and outsiders, this fear of attack, both by the physical forces of hostile Indians in the area, but also the spiritual malevolence of Satan and his servants that has to be understood before we can go any farther in this story. Because without this background, the panic and the horror that begins to unfold in this small town would be impossible to understand. But we're going to cover that in the next episode. I hope that you're enjoying this episode on witchcraft, the witch craze, and the Salem witch trials. If you are enjoying it, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone else that you think would enjoy it too.